All right, hello, Honors 110. Hope everyone's doing well. Start off today's class just with a reminder. Essay number 2 is due a week from today, so coming up very soon at this point. Also a reminder that we have an optional live session coming up. Depending on when I get this posted, I'm hoping to have this posted in the relatively early morning on Tuesday, so this will still be when that live session is in the future. But in case it's not, you may have already missed the session, so sorry if that's the case. But it's 11 a.m. on Tuesday, and I messaged out all of the meeting details a couple times, so you should be able to see those in your inbox on Canvas and whatever email address you have those routing to. So hope to see some of you there. They're not mandatory, they're not super structured in content. Especially for this one, I scheduled it such that it would be at a point where I thought it would be helpful to folks in planning for essay number 2, especially if you wanted to ask any questions about a thesis statement you have coming up, or to clarify feedback from essay number 1. In a way that's useful to have that as kind of a group discussion with other students. So as always, not mandatory. I don't hold it against anybody if they can't make it. I don't give you extra credit if you do make it. But if you do find that helpful without having to schedule an individual meeting with me, you can just come. From my experience thus far, usually we don't have a ton of people. I think we've maxed out for any of my classes around like 7 or 8 people. So so there is a good chance to get some FaceTime and to actually ask questions that matter to you. If there are things you'd really like feedback on or clarified or whatnot. We can also talk about the readings, of course. I think it's a good chance to kind of go over things that maybe we didn't go into enough depth on in our written discussion, or that you were really interested and brought up in the discussion board format, but no one really commented on or picked up on. As I'm sure you've seen, I comment on a fairly limited number of posts, mostly just because I find that I tend to go to one extreme or another, and if I start commenting on a lot of posts, I end up spending hours and hours commenting there, which isn't the worst thing, but also it tends to drain me a little bit and not give me time to do as much in terms of lesson planning and grading and all of that. So I kind of moderate that, but I am very happy to engage with ideas, and sometimes these live discussions are a cleaner opportunity for us to just kind of go back and forth and really talk about things in real time. So hope some of you can make it. I'll see anyone who does. But also still feel free to be in touch if you'd like to, discuss what you're doing for essay number 2, if you want feedback on anything. The closer we get to the deadline, I usually say that 1 week out is the latest we can go in terms of sending me a full paper for any kind of review. If you want to send me, though, your ideas for a thesis statement, or a paragraph that you're kind of grappling with and wanted feedback on, I'm still open to that sort of thing kind of throughout this week. When we get to the weekend, it's getting a little late to give feedback on anything, but if you have quick questions, please feel free to be in touch, and I'll do my best to try to get back to folks still at that point as well. But okay, so with all that said, though, we're on to Unit 3 in this course. When I've taught this course in the past, usually this is the point at which, if it's an in-person class, we've built a degree of kind of, comfortability in the classroom. We've been talking about a lot of things regarding education and identity. We started to get to know each other on a fairly, I don't want to say deep level, not like we're, friends or family necessarily, but we built some sort of classroom community and camaraderie and all of that. That is a little bit different online, where I think we've developed some degree of comfort. I think you can start to, identify some of your peers who, think along similar lines to you, or who clearly contrast in their points of view with you. So you kind of have some sense of who each other are in a lot of cases. When I was doing this class in the spring semester, we transitioned to online teaching just before we got into this unit. So right towards the end of Unit 2, and we had spring break, and UNLV basically closed down at that point for in-person instruction for the rest of that semester. So in any event, this is all a roundabout way of saying this unit can be uncomfortable. And I'm not sure ultimately if it's more or less uncomfortable for being online in this case, or for our whole semester having been remote. I think that there are some clear pros in that we have the advantage of you don't have to talk publicly about sex or about relationships or things like that might not be altogether comfortable for you in a public setting. On the other hand, you have to write about them, right? So in some cases, I think that's helpful just for clarity of communicating ideas and you're really getting into things. In some cases, that can be even less comfortable because you're sort of putting it out there in a written form where it's clearly attached to your name. you can't say someone misheard you or anything like that. So I get all of that. I'm going to ask that, this has gone for the whole class, and many of you have been really good about, delving into your personal experience and how it speaks to the texts and some of the bigger philosophical questions we're grappling with. But especially for this unit, because of how personal it can be in terms of your experiences, your beliefs, your values, all of this sort of stuff related to relationships, sex, and love. I'm going to ask that we, be respectful of each other, that we consider it, unless you have explicit permission, that what is said in this online discussion board or in these group-led discussions and so on and so forth stays in this environment. So we're not, spreading other people's dirty laundry. I know some of you know each other from outside of class. I'm sure some of you do not know very many of each other outside of class. So, it varies what mileage you would get out of sharing someone else's story anyway. But, erring towards the side of just, respecting each other. Again, considering this is a safe space, considering it's an open space, there are probably going to be at least a few times throughout this unit where we're going to disagree on some significant things. Be that values such as premarital sex versus waiting until marriage. Be that in terms of what is truly consensual sex versus what is not. We have one. I would actually argue two stories to kind of grapple very intensively with that question. And all kind of points in between. And so I don't want to spoil anything significant about the readings, more so just to say we're going to cover a lot of ground, some of which may be, relatively uncomfortable. Fortunately, outside of the group-led discussions, I'm going to be the only one who's directly speaking to these issues in a video format. For the rest of it, you'll be, writing your responses. So we'll see where things go from there. But really look forward to your, honest, earnest input. Again, a big part of my thought process with this unit is, for many of you, particularly in regards to the more sex-oriented pieces of this unit, sex may have been a part of your life already, or may currently be, or may be in the near future. Maybe you want it to be, but it's not yet. If that's going to be a part of the discussion for you, though, I think it's something that is important that you're able to, think critically about, and read about and process and communicate with others about and have some respectful discourse around. So I think in our culture, we tend to treat these things as pretty taboo. And in fact, I think that's a big part of what both of today's readings kind of get at, in one case very directly, in one case pretty indirectly. But I consider that to be kind of at the heart of both of these readings, of the things that we don't talk about that we probably really should talk about. So approaching it, from that perspective, at least that's where I'm starting out from. So without further ado, getting into our first reading for this time. So the Oatman Stanford reading on the history of condoms. So with this reading, I think it's an interesting one, in part because it's sort of a historical account. So a couple of you commented in the past on readings that are very factual versus ones that are more stories versus ones that are more philosophical. So this one I would place more on the historical, just kind of information side of things, albeit with some degree of an agenda. Right, it's clear that they're not kind of value neutral in presenting this thing. So. In this reading, though, we have all of these images kind of scattered throughout, which I think are a big plus of this reading. Is part of why I presented it the way that I did, sort of in copy and pasting the whole thing, not just the text from where it originally appeared. So we have these images of, actual condom cases and advertisements and whatnot that some of them I think are just sort of funny, right? They're sort of in some of the puns and some of the ways they get around saying exactly what they are. And some of it is sort of, I think, kind of fascinating in terms of the degree to which we don't say what these things are, on the wrapper, on the packaging, on the advertisements, in that effort to avoid, kind of directly addressing sex or, making a value judgment about it. I wanted to go to page 3 in this actual article here. And I'm just going by the pages of the PDF, so I didn't give you actual page numbers the way that this one's reproduced. It says, Comstock felt that condoms and any other form of contraception were just a license to sexual excess. And I'm curious what we think of this, because I think some of us might agree with that idea. And if that's where you are, that's fine. Please feel free to bring that point of view. I would suggest if I were teaching this same class, some 50, 60 years ago, probably many of us would have that framework that we're working from of, as soon as we open the door to, offering up safe sex sex, that's giving you license essentially to say like, yeah, you should have it, right? Which is kind of problematic in a number of ways, but at least from my point of view, I should say. Again, some of you might disagree with me on that. But what what your reaction to Comstock and the Comstock Act that's depicted here? And this question of why were condoms ordered via mail? And I think that this is an element that I think is still relatively relatable, right? When we think about, I'm not going to ask you any of you to speak directly to your personal experience unless you want to, but I'll say as a young man, when I was first in the market for such items, I was really trepidatious about walking into a store and asking for them, right? And that's basically how I would get them, because it was a point at which you couldn't order things like this online, or you probably could, but nonetheless that would be sort of an extra step that would be unusual. So having to go into a drugstore and actually ask an associate, where these are being sold, or if they're behind the counter, having to ask for them by name. That's an uncomfortable experience inherently. Even just thinking about it, I'm remembering that old discomfort. Ordering them by mail, that makes a little sense of it being a little bit more comfortable in that less direct kind of process. And it's sort of like, when people consume, erotic, fiction, or when they watch videos of that nature, people generally don't do that in a public sphere, right? They'll consume often on a private device. I know from a friend who writes erotica, that she informed me that apparently erotica sells much better in kind of Kindle formats now, because someone could be sitting on a bus, or sitting waiting in line somewhere, just reading something on a Kindle. No one has any idea what they're reading, as opposed to holding a hard copy of a book that might have a really lurid cover and might draw some judgment, right? So anyway, I that's some interesting kind of food for thought there. But jumping ahead to page 8, there's this quote. What's interesting about that moment historically, as far as ads for any product that had a sexual purpose, is that there's a cryptic language being used that made people think about the real function without ever actually saying it. So this guides me to the bigger, more generalized question that I'm going to kind of leave most of this article open for you to hop around and dive into other pieces of it. But why are we so uncomfortable as a generalized contemporary American culture talking about sex? Right? Different cultures are more open about this sort of thing in different contexts and whatnot. But by and large, I would say, it still is an uncomfortable thing, right? Again, if we were in the physical classroom, some people are more eager, more open in talking about this thing. But if I had to gauge the average, or, if no one breaks the ice and starts asking questions about this sort of thing, most people aren't going to bring it up, right? So I guess I want to leave that open-ended question in terms of why we think people are so uncomfortable talking about sex. Why, again, young version of me would be, really nervous about going up and asking for condoms. Where does the stigma come from? Why is this stuff taboo? And there's no wrong answer here, right? I think that there are several that probably come immediately to mind for a number of you. Some of it might be more nuanced, though. So, why we're uncomfortable talking about sex, and to a lesser extent, why relationships, why marriages, all this stuff is also considered more personal in nature, right? And that's not to say that's wrong. I actually, in some ways, be it out of traditionalism or be it just out of my personal kind of leanings, agree with that sentiment. That I don't like to kind of broadcast, my marriage, via social media, and I don't, go talking about, the specifics of it, very openly with anyone outside of, my closest friends and family. But why we sort of treat it that way? Because it's not a foregone conclusion that we would. Okay, so I'm gonna leave that reading there. Again, there's plenty more that we could cover, so please feel free to respond to the questions and the specific quotes I gave you, but also to hop around wherever you like. But so the other piece I want to look at was this Kevin Brockmeyer story that I shared with you, The Ceiling. And part of what I really like about this story, this is probably in my top 10 favorite short stories. So if you really didn't like it, that's fine. We don't have to agree on that. But it's a story I really enjoy. And a big piece of that is that I think you could read this on a 100% metaphorical level, as in there is legitimately a ceiling that is coming down from the sky that is going to crush everyone, and this is how these people are choosing to respond. And I think the story mostly works on that level. You could sort of read it outside the context of a unit about relationships, sex, and love, and think that the relationship, the marriage depicted here is sort of incidental to the broader plot of this kind of apocalyptic event. And I think the story still works on that level. But I think that we could also read this much more metaphorically. So if we drill in here in terms of what this is about, and I'm sure many of you are already casting your own metaphorical views on this, probably which are in fairly close alignment with each other. But what we have, early on in the piece, Melissa adding an ice cube to her glass, and the observation that the ceiling is getting bigger, that it looks as though this object in the sky that's coming towards them is increasing in size, or it becomes clear that it is coming towards them and is not just some anomaly that's floating up there in the sky. And that being, to me, the first kind of cue that this is in some way speaking to their relationship, that it's not just about the more literal story that's happening here, but this is speaking to their marriage in some meaningful way. Next place I wanted to go was on the third page here. Let's see. Okay, yeah, so this is towards the end of that page. I'm just going to read this paragraph on the second to last paragraph, the last full paragraph, technically on page 3. It was the beginning of July, before she began to ease back into the life of our family. By this time, the object in the sky was large enough to eclipse the full moon. Our friends insisted that they had never been able to see any change in my wife at all, that she had the same style of speaking, the same habits and twists and eccentricities as ever. This was, in a certain sense, true. I noticed the difference chiefly when we were alone together. And so this is ostensibly talking about how she's responding to this object, the ceiling coming down. But I think it doesn't take very much for us to read this as a commentary on her changing and how she's interacting with her husband here. That these characters are not the same as they once were together. And then let's see. Okay, so there's this other piece. The actual function of the toy is like some sort of obstacle, he said. They'll dream up a new use for everything in the world. I just pulled this as one kind of more miscellaneous quote, but we can find these kind of quotes scattered throughout the story of moments where there's a hint that the way we see something might not be the only way we could see something, right? Just kind of, in many ways, kind of focusing our attention that there could be a larger metaphor at work here. So I'm going to spell out what I think is kind of the easiest read of this story on metaphorical level, not the most nuanced read, and please feel free to add on to this, or to say if you disagree, or if you just didn't see it when you first read it, because actually I think, again, that's part of, to me, why it's so successful as a story is I think you could read it without the metaphor and mostly still kind of have all the pieces add up and enjoy the story, and only when you go back realize and kind of put together these pieces and get even more out of the story. But the idea that the ceiling that's coming down is going to crush them all, it's going to mean the end of their world, is largely a metaphor for the end of this marriage, right? That these two characters have kind of grown apart, that our narrator knows it, that he is kind of feeling Melissa slip away from him, and this is his way of kind of contextualizing, of kind of understanding it as, the sky is falling in a Chicken Little sort of sense. The world is ending for him in this very meaningful way. And then there's this pivotal scene in this thing where they're outside the bakery, and our narrator, he goes based on that his son Joshua says that he saw the bakery in a dream, and goes there with his son, sees his wife in there with this neighbor, with this other man. So in case you missed it, this seems pretty steadily to suggest that she's cheating on him, that she's having an affair with this other man. When he sees her, when they recognize that this is going on, there's a number of different ways in which he could respond to this situation, right? He could go in there, start a fight with this neighbor, right? Basically just kind of say, you're cheating with my wife. Let's get into it. Or he could pretend it's not happening, completely ignore it, walk away. He could confront his wife, in a very private conversation later. He sends his son to knock on the window, right? Which is a very unusual choice. This is not the default that I think most anyone would go to. In part, it's super passive, right? To send your son to kind of, not really fight a battle here, but to be the representative here. This is probably a moment that the son later on is going to realize, what it actually meant. I don't think it's implied that he really does in the moment of the story. There's a way in which that some students have suggested, I'm inclined to agree, that it feels especially vindictive, where, it's not just, I'm going to say that you were caught in the act. I'm going to show you our son first to highlight what you're doing to our family, right? Which I'm sure that Melissa already knows, has some concept in her head of what she's doing to her family. He's kind of, turning the screw there a little bit, so to speak. But in any event, I'm curious, how folks react to this. Because I've had some students say that this is brilliant, this is exactly what they would do, or better than that they would think to do. I've had some students suggest like this is really immature on his part, or this is too passive on his part. This is passive aggressive on his part. I think there's multiple different ways of reading it. And again, I think this is part of the success of the story, that Brockmire doesn't necessarily spell out how we're supposed to read it, but rather we can, to some degree, project our own values on that moment. Okay, so again, like our other story, a ton more that we could unpack here, get into. I'm going to leave it there for this story as well. So feel free to engage with the different pieces I led you to and things that I have said, but also to open this up to your own interpretation as well. But more broadly, these pieces I would suggest overlap in that both in the Oatman Stanford kind of history of the condom and in the story of the ceiling, a lot of it's about what we don't say, right? Because this narrator is contextualizing this whole dissolution of his marriage through the lens of this ceiling. And whether we read that as real or 100% metaphor or somewhere on that spectrum, nonetheless, it certainly is taking focus off of something that feels like it would be the center of his experience, doesn't want to talk about it, right? Doesn't even want to confront his wife directly when he finds out what's happening, sends his son over, why he's so dedicated to not talking about what seems to be a very real issue in their marriage, and by the end of their marriage. And then similarly, again, Oatman Stanford, so much for being about us not talking about the condom, not talking about sex, what that says about us, what that says about our history, how that's evolved. I think it's plenty of food for thought there. So I'll leave today's readings there. The one other piece that I did want to just touch upon briefly is our readings for next time. There's two of them, one quite short, one a little bit longer, but sort of counterintuitively, I think the shorter one is much denser and much more challenging. Some of you may have encountered it in high school. I've had a number of students, especially in AP classes, who have encountered it before. So read it over. You'll have a head start, sort of understanding it if you have read it before. But nonetheless, if you get a little stuck on it, you're not sure what you ultimately read. If you've not encountered this before, especially, don't get too bogged down in it. Just make sure you've read it. You do your best to think about it, but kind of let it go at that point. And rest assured, we'll talk about it a lot more in our next class. Otherwise, though, for the other reading, Justin Taylor's Sun Gold, it's a longer reading. I think it's a relatively easy read. I think the way the language, the voice is kind of put together, allows it to kind of flow very quickly. The heads up I want to give is there's a lot of vulgar language, some pretty misogynistic kind of language in there as well, some very sexist kind of ideas baked in, especially from our protagonists, but also from some of the other characters. And I always like to kind of forewarn students, I'm not endorsing this as a way we should be in the world. The more so, I think it's a valuable thing for us to read in order to kind of reflect on things. Not to overgeneralize, oversimplify things, but I think that our male kind of protagonist in this story largely represents what a lot of young men start out with as a viewpoint. Maybe exaggerated in some ways, but ideas that are not foreign to us nonetheless. And so I think for our male identifying students, for some of us, this can be useful as an exercise of kind of looking at our own experience and maybe some things that we used to think, or some ways that we've kind of talked about things that maybe we regret now, or at least think more critically about now. For some of the women in the classroom, not say this is new to you, because I think some of the objectification and some of the way women are treated is all too familiar to many students, but nonetheless, to get it from this other angle, and see how this character kind of changes as over the course of the story, if you think he changed, that itself is kind of a point for debate. So that's enough preview for those two stories. But otherwise, just looking ahead to the next week, just one more bit of head up, then I'll stop talking in this overlong video lecture. But again, essay number 2 is due a week from today. There is no reading due that day for 2 reasons. One is that with the essay due, I want to make sure you have time to, focus on that and not put undue pressure on you. But two, because the following reading, Ogawa's The Diving Pool, is I think our longest reading for this semester, or it's right up there with the Davidson and I think one other reading that are definitely the longest ones that we encounter over the course of the semester. It's not super dense. I don't think it'll get bogged down in the way that you might some of our readings, but nonetheless, it's just a lot of pages. I think it's like 50 pages. So there's no reading assignment for next Tuesday, in part just to kind of buffer that and give you a leg up if you want to start that reading early. I know Group 3 is going to be giving us a group-led discussion on that reading, so I imagine they've probably already started reading, or if they haven't, no time like the present. I encourage you to get started on that. But nonetheless, want to give you all of that heads up just about what things will look like next week, because it is an unusual week for our class. We'll still have a discussion for October 27th. October 27th? Yeah, that's right. We'll still have a discussion for that day, but it won't have a reading that we're based on. I will. There'll be a video component. That's all I'll say for now. But then again, it'll be a longer reading for the next time. But okay, I'm going to cut myself off there. Thank you all for listening, and I will catch you next time.